All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming on our second lecture from our guest lecture series. And it is a collaboration between School of Architecture, Planning and Policy Development of ITB and the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, the University of Melbourne. And as I mentioned, this is the second lecture of the series. We have Greg here, Greg Missingham, to give a lecture today. And I thank you, Greg, for making time and joining us here. And we will have Pak Agus Ekomadio as our moderator. So before I start, I think I will have to remind all the participants, if you wanna pose a question to Greg, you can always put it on the chat and we will read it later after the talk. So without further ado, I will hand over this lecture to Pak Agus. Please, Pak Agus.
Thank you, Roro, and thank you again, Greg, to join us again. In the morning, we will, I think the public lecture of Greg is about the critical and reflective thinking. In the morning, we start to critical thinking, reflective thinking, but it's challenge, Greg, how to make, what is it, our student, our audience to more enthusiasm in the morning, because your matters to deliver to us is very important about our learning. Yes, the audience, I also mentioned that when we discussed before with Greg, he introduced himself and R is a pedagogue. So interesting, it's interesting. The Greg presentation is about how design is a mode of learning. It's more universal than just the solving the problem or applied creativity. Firstly, I will read what the short biography of Greg Missingham. Gregory K. Missingham is a principal honorary fellow in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, the University of Melbourne. Has taught at all four Victorian School of Architecture and visiting professor at both National University in Nanjing, China, and has been a guest design critic at school in Australia, London, China, Indonesia, and Malaysia. He was a principal design architect. So you are professional, Greg, from the Public Works Department of Victoria and a principal in architectural practice for 8 years. Building residential care, education housing project, and writing strategic master plan, functional brief, and feasibility study for higher education and the justice sector. This research focused on simultaneous satisfying both people's expectation of their environment and designers' desire to be artists. Design education, consulting, East Asian Garden, public buildings, and cinema profit source material. He has participated in several exhibitions and as a landscape designer on prize-winning teams in competition in China. I think it's time to you, Greg, to deliver your presentation. And so we enjoy Greg's presentation. Please, Greg.
Thank you, Agus. Good morning, all. I'm going to be talking about critical thinking primarily, but in the way you practice your own development of your personal designing. So my topic is designing your designing. That's what I mean by this, but how to improve your designing through critical reflection. I'm having some trouble. I'll go back there. It's not behaving itself. Today's talk. Critical thinking in design. Critical reflection in design, a model of designing, and then I'm going to talk about examples of ways of thinking that you can try out on your own work. Most of the time, the talking is going to be the first three, and most of the slides are going to be about the second two. So we start. Why should we be interested in critical thinking? Well, let's imagine you're a young architect working in an office. You've been given a project to work on and you have an idea. Your problem is to persuade other people that it's a good idea and that they should help you with it, or that the boss should take it on, or that your consultant should understand why you want to do it this way, or give you advice on it. Maybe you're, in the rare case as a young architect that you get to talk to the client, maybe you want to persuade the client. So you've got to come up with an argument for why you want to do this thing. That entails critical thinking. And one of the things you'll learn in practice is that you've got to spend a lot of time persuading other people of what you want to do and why. They'll always be interested in why you want to do it. And that's what critical thinking helps you do. It helps you find out what that thing is, the why of doing things. And it also, the second part is that you want to know why in this particular circumstance should you do these things. And you want to know how to do and why should you do it in this way. So not only is it the product of the designing that entails critical thinking, but also the how to do it entails critical thinking. Why do you need 6 people to work on the project? For example, why should X do this, Y do that, and Z do that part of the work, for example? All of these are entail critical thinking, where you say, okay, these are the possibilities. This is why I choose this one, and this is my reasons for doing that. This is why I reject these other options. Those are critical thinking. Now, Mr. John Clark, he points out that critical thinking is self-directed, self-disciplined, self-monitored, and self-corrective thinking. It's not somebody else telling you what to think. It's you working out why you think what you think. And this is the crucial part. Okay, so critical thinking in designing. Critical thinking is, as self-directed, we're following Clark here, self-disciplined, self-monitored, self-directed. It means that you come up with the ideas, you come up with the analysis, you come up with the evaluation of the outcome, you come up with the recommendations for what to do next. It's self-disciplined. You're not dependent on other people telling you what to think. You're not depending on other people for when you think it. And you're monitoring your own thinking. Self-monitored. Self-corrected thinking as well. Oh, I had an idea about how to do this lecture. I was thinking about it, and I had lots of slides about the criticality and all of those sort of arguments. And I thought, no, for this particular audience, you'll understand better what I'm trying to say if I give you some examples, what other people have done, and how you might take a particular procedure for yourself. All right. The other thing is it's based on evidence, critical thinking. In this particular case, the evidence is normally your own design, the product of your thinking as you're working on it. It's you look at it very, very carefully and you say, oh, that's not quite doing what I want. And you've got to be a little bit more careful about being clear about what you want in the first place about a design, and then you can go back and check it afterwards. The situation you're normally in critical thinking is that you've got a proposal for different reasons. And then you evaluate the outcome of that proposal, and then you check whether or not the reasons are satisfied, or whether you've got to modify your reasons or you've got to modify the outcome as you're working on it. And it's a dialogue, goes back and forth between you. Donald Schoen used to speak about having a dialogue with the drawings. For designers, to this abstract critical thinking, I would add it's self-initiated most often. You come up with, you're making a proposal for something in the future. Nigel Cross pointed out that if you're interested in the natural world, you take up science as a study. If you're mostly interested in other people and what they do and what the country's doing and things like that, you're interested in the humanities or arts. If you want to change the world, you're a designer. So you're making a proposal about the future. All right. That's often why it's scary. Now I'm going to have a little side trip about, in a few slides, I'm going to talk about what I think design, the structure of designing is and why you might find it very hard and complicated. But critical thinking will help you. Design thinking, when you make it explicit, in other words, you put down on paper what your intentions are, and then you put down what you find, how you evaluate it, is a particularly powerful form of critical thinking. Design thinking itself is regarded as one of the key forms of thinking that tells you that you are a human. And it's one of the highest and most difficult forms of thinking. We'll see a bit why in a minute. Okay. So what I've been saying is that critical thinking in design is being explicit about what you're trying to do and why. Plus, when you've done some little bit of designing, you look at how well did you succeed in that and why. This entails two sets of comparisons. This level of critical thinking is also called deliberative thinking. You make a conjecture, a proposal, and then you test it or examine it, evaluate it. And it is iterative. This means you do it over and over and over again, and you get closer and closer and closer to a satisfying result. So the aim is less about getting it right this time. When students talk to me about, do you think this is right? I always say there's no such thing as right or wrong in designing. There's better and worse, but not right or wrong. It's not that kind of either or situation. You've only got to think about competition entries. Hundreds and hundreds of people can submit a competition entry that is probably work for the task, but they're all very different. So in that sense, there can't be a right answer. There's many, many ways usually of doing most designing. All right. So I don't like this diagram very much. I don't think I did a good job, but anyway. First thing is you've got something you intend. This is your design intent. And there's a design outcome. These are different. And this is where I'm trying to get you to try and be explicit about what you're trying to achieve in your designing. Because in a sense, the design outcome is not about your body. It's not, the thing on the paper is independent of you. You've got to be able to sit back dispassionately and examine it. And this is what critical thinking is about. So design intent, design outcome, or in your course case, mostly not going to be on paper, it's going to be on a screen. Okay. So we can examine what the design intent is and what the outcome it is, or we can examine why we had that design intent and why we wanted that design outcome. So that gives us at least 4 comparisons. I can compare what I wanted and what I got. I can compare why I wanted it and why I got what I got. Or I can look at it and compare what I wanted and why I did it that way, or the outcome and why I did it that way. So there's lots of comparisons involved. And if you're trying to be clear to yourself and make progress as a critical thinker, you'll distinguish these different cases and some other matters as well, as I'll also get to. All right. So critical thinking entails this deliberative thinking. This is what I'm trying to do. This is why, and this is what the outcome was, and possibly why. Okay, so critical reflection in design. Again, reflection means that it's like the obvious example of reflection is looking in a mirror. You're looking at yourself. So in reflective thinking, you're looking at your own thinking. All right. So for critical reflective thinking, the evidence is the work, maybe your notes and some archive materials. Maybe, I keep a notebook with me most of the time. So I've got a whole stack of them here on the bookshelf. I can go back over why I did things and what I was trying to do. But all of these, this list of items here are provide evidence of what you're trying to do. And critical thinking is using that evidence to help you get better. Now, I think especially that the notes that are about your intentions and your ambitions for projects and your answers to that question, why, are the most important thing. The outcomes is like the model you're making or the drawing you're making, sure, that's evidence. But unless you compare it to what your intention was, it's not really helpful. And a lot of us have the experience of the outcome being disappointed compared to what we imagined in our head. And that's just being disappointed is not sufficient. You want to be able to go back and say, well, how do I get closer to my ambition? All right. So consider this self-initiated and directed. I mean, it's your thinking. What was initiated and directed? How and why? Self-discipline. What did you have to be rigorous or careful about? What required discipline and what was easy? Self-monitored. What did you notice? What were the key bits of evidence that you used to say, oh, I'm doing well, or this is going well? Oh, I don't like what the outcome is. I should start again. One of the worst things you can do is, and it really is very bad, I've had students do it in week 10 of a 12-week semester. Start again without examining what you've got already. There's surely something good in what you've got. And it's a lot of waste of time just to put it in the bin and start all out completely again. When you're a much more experienced designer, maybe you can prepare, because you know you can work very quickly towards a design once you've got a lot of experience. Yes, maybe you can put it in the bin, but it's not a really good idea to throw it entirely in the bin without looking at what you've got. Why didn't it work? That might tell you quite a lot. The way our brain works, we learn best from mistakes or surprises. Otherwise, your brain just does what it normally does. You don't learn anything. Self-corrected thinking. What have you learned from the scrutiny of your own design thinking? What worked well? What might you try next time? What will you avoid? All of these are issues to do with critical thinking. Here's an example of a former student of mine. He's now a professional architectural photographer in Vancouver. And he says he asks himself these questions at the end of every year. And this is about photography, but this is somebody having an annual critical think about their own practice as a designer. I encourage you to do it. All right, next. So let's look a bit more closely at reflective thinking. Reflective thinking, I actually find it hard a bit. I don't find it hard to read something I've written and see how I can improve that. But looking back at my own thinking about ideas and things like that unless I put it down explicitly, it's really hard to deal with. And a lot of people try to do it without writing it down or making some notes to have a think about them outside. Making them explicit into notes means that you dispassionately can look at it for yourself. And it might be diagrams you're being reflective about. This is the standard model. It's called the Gibbs model because Mr. Gibbs was an educational philosopher. And he thought that this was what was going on, or was a good way to examine your own thinking. So the first step was this bit. You notice when you're looking at your work that you have some kind of emotional reaction to it. You're getting a thrill. Oh, this is going well. Or I don't like this, but I don't know why. It feels bad. The emotional feelings are, and when we know, for example, the way the brain works again, that unless you have emotions, you can't think. Forget all that business about suppose sociopathic killers and so on, not having emotions is rubbish. You have a feeling about the design, and then that's a clue. What was good and about the experience? This is when you're thinking about your reaction. Oh, the emotional that you had an emotional reaction is a clue that it's threatening or supporting your personal values as a designer or as a human being even. Okay. So then you evaluate the feelings. What was good and bad about the experience? Then you do that's the emotional part, component of reflective thinking. Then you have what you might call the cerebral part, where you do some analysis. What sense can you make of the situation? What else could you have done? Now, you might do this in a split second and not notice. I've had quite a few students who don't understand reflective thinking, and you can point out to them in their conversation with you that they're doing it. All right, they go through. You might do this very quickly and not. That's why you don't notice that you do it. What else could you have done? All right, and then so that's the cognitive part, and then the final bit is an action plan and a description of what happened. Well, that's really that bar there is where you switch to the next cycle. Okay, so that's the constructive part. So emotional, cognitive, constructive. That's the cycle of reflective thinking. There's a completely other way to look at it that comes from design itself. It comes from a man called Donald Schoen, who I mentioned earlier, who was a professor of planning at MIT. And he was known to be quite a thinker about how to work in teams and that sort of thing. And he'd written some interesting books, but especially he got interested in well, it started with the dean of the architecture school asking him to come and have a look at their teaching. And Schoen decided after a while that actually studio teaching was one of the best ways to teach on the planet. Now, his book was called The Reflective Practitioner. And he was looking at professionals, particularly lawyers, doctors, and architects, and how they behaved, he thought, differently from scientists, particularly scientists. and technicians. So he started talking about thinking in action. Now, what's thinking in action? Next time you get on a bicycle, you just ride on your bicycle, don't you? Well, that's until you try and dodge a pothole or a dog that's trying to nip your heels, you're not thinking in action. But that's what thinking in action is. You're in activity, in an activity that you're usually doing. Maybe you've got a pencil on a piece of paper or a stylus on your screen, or you're typing in commands. After a while, you don't notice what commands, you're just doing it. But it's when you have to sit back and say, oh, I've got to change what I'm doing, that you're starting to think while you're actually doing it. That's thinking in action. And Schoen thought there were three types of this. Knowing in action was that bottom one, how to ride a bike without thinking about it. Some people talk about body memory. Reflection in action is the phrase that most often gets quoted about his thinking. It's when you're thinking on what you're doing. Oh, I've got to dodge that pothole. I've got to dodge that dog. I'll say hello to my friend while I'm still riding the bike. All right. Now, reflection on reflection in action. I'm suspicious whether you can do this while you're actually in action, because implicitly, to reflect on some reflecting means that you're looking back at it, like looking in a mirror. So it might be a fraction, a little second later than the actual action. When you dodge the puddle and you say, oh, I could have done that better for next time. Okay. Now, I've had lots of students who don't understand these terms when I first introduced them. So I used another way of phrasing it. So thinking about the task, thinking about the design strategy and tactics you're using, or thinking about your own design thinking. They're sort of the same three levels, but in designer speak, you might say. So here we are. Levels of thinking. Task thinking, that's where problem solving. That's where problem solving is. Reflective thinking and reflexive thinking. Reflective thinking is you're looking back at the task. Task thinking is when you're focused on the task, and reflexive thinking is you're thinking about thinking. It sounds very complicated, but we'll see that it is. But you do it all the time. Think about getting dressed in the morning. Why do you choose the clothes you do? That's a design decision. And it's got all sorts of things about presenting yourself in your best light to the world. It's got to do with comfort. It's got to do with what's available and clean. So you juggle all of those things to put the best foot forward. Okay. One way to talk about what I've just listed as the design column is to call it analytic thinking, because it's after the fact. Schoen says that it happens in the present. Analytical thinking is what you write in your journal, and it's in the past. So that implies there's thinking in the future. Well, certainly it's thinking that's applied to the future. And that's what Nigel Cross claims designing was all about. So, future. Deliberative thinking. I've been talking about deliberative thinking. This is which is proactive. In other words, it happens before you need to. And you evaluate the outcome. The classic model of designing. You're trying to design the ideas, concepts, and conjectures. What would happen if is a conjecture? What would happen if the wall curled round like this way, rather than there was a column there? What would happen if the airflow could be changed in these ways, interesting ways? Those are conjectures. And that's thinking about the task. Reflective designing is a bit more, I normally do things in terms of circles and squares. What would happen if I considered it as a flow of materials, or I considered it as a geometry of a field, you know, the way trees and plants are scattered in the forest. You know, and you start thinking about metaphors and analogies and things that in reflective designing. Framing your own designing, which I'm going to concentrate on a little bit in a minute, is where I've had a lot of graduate students over the years complain about how they design. I'm not sure what it is, but it's often young women who complain that they design boxes all the time. I look at their work and there's exquisitely beautiful rectilinear designs, beautifully detailed, thought out, work perfectly, easy to construct. They look lovely. It reminds me of my sisters who used to complain about, you know, one sister had curly hair and one complained all the time she wanted straight hair. Another sister had straight hair and she complained all the time she wanted curly hair. So framing your designing can be about changing the way you've been doing things for some time. And it might be an attempt to construct a way of designing that's personal to you and differentiates you from the mob. This is where you begin to grow up as a designer and you forget what's fashionable. Which is really difficult, by the way. You can decide to be, I'm going to do what I like to do rather than what is going on in the magazines. You stop following fashion and you start thinking for yourself more and more confidently about why you will do things your way. That's framing your designing. Okay. This is design thinking, that column there. And these three together are concerned with designing your own designing at several levels, as we'll see. Okay, let's look at designing itself. We've talked about critical thinking and I've talked about reflective thinking. Now look about what you apply them to. So I'm going to give you my model of designing. Okay. At the easiest level, you're all familiar with the issue of ideas. Oh, I need an idea or a concept. Some people use idea and concept interchangeably. Some people think they're different. We won't go into that argument here, but they're both about the same level. Okay. Getting ideas for a design is embedded usually in the process of actively designing. So ideas are, I'll come back in a minute. And then there's what I call design depots. You probably won't understand what I mean by that, but I'll get to it in a minute. Okay. And then finally, underneath that is a design frame. So there's 4 levels, I think, that are happening simultaneously. Frames last, they're mostly unconscious and they last for very long periods of time for some designers. You gradually develop a frame as you mature as a designer, and you might change once or twice. If you think of Frank Gehry's career, you can probably pick 2 or 3 periods in it. And that's got to do with a flip in frame. Design depots are to do with where you store. It's like a municipal depot, your local government area, where they store a whole lot of equipment, a whole lot of materials. They may have training sessions for the staff. They may have project rooms to learn new skills. All of that's in the design depot. And when you get a new project, then you apply it to it. Some of them are discarded over time, and some new materials stop being used, like asbestos, for example. So you have to learn new materials. So the design depot changes over time, but more quickly than a frame. And obviously actively designing lasts for the period of the project. And you might have, I once knew an office that had 400 projects going on at the same time. I still know the office, but they don't have that many projects now. Okay, so actively designing is a shorter period of time, and ideas, if they can go pass through your head, and if you haven't written it down or haven't made a diagram or clipped out the piece of paper, you've lost it. So one way of thinking of these layers, and they're all happening at the same time, is that they've got different half-lives in the sense of atomic materials. Or the other way to think about them is ideas have no inertia. Actively designing does have some, because you've got financial constraints on how much time you spend. You've got a deadline to meet, so that, it's going to be, you can't totally throw out what you've already done and start again, for example. Design depots last for quite a long time. This is where you remember things. You have standard details in the office. You learn that there's particular ways of constructing a building that you're interested in, or you might not be interested in construction at all. So you choose the standard way of doing it that you know will work, but you focus on the way you make space, or you focus on the environmental consequences of what you're doing, or you focus on dealing with a local community. The part of designing you like is working as a kind of coach to the community. All right. Now, those are all about what you're designing and how you're designing is true at all of these different levels. So there's 8 things going on at the same time when you're making design decisions. And this is what reflexive thinking, critical thinking gets complicated. But if you want to control all of these levels or improve in any of them, you've got to be careful. Okay. The red ones are to do with the project itself. The 2 blue ones are primarily about you as a designer. What you like, what you've learned to do, and what you know how to do is in the level of the design depot. And the frames are lurking underneath that. Now, all of this, that's why I think it's so complicated, is embedded in, all of it's got to do with, is the question why lurking around all the time, but it's embedded in a braided river of history. You imagine that there's a single dot somewhere in there. Somewhere in there is a single dot. And that's the current project that you're working on, the ideas you're having about it. This is history. This is your associations in life passing through time in the other direction. And the base level that we were looking at, those frames down there, they get more and more, you can't tell quite the difference what everybody else thinks and what's got to do with history in the profession. From what's going on in society. Okay, now that's very complicated, or I've made it complicated. We've got critical reflection, critical thinking, and which becomes critical reflection in design. What I've just shown you, in my view, is what you're applying that to and why you need to apply critical thinking as you're thinking out a design. So I think there are some vehicles that you possibly know already that can be used for training yourself in your own critical thinking. There's reflective or design journals. I hope you have to keep these for your current projects. There are decision diaries. So I'll explain what they are. And there are comparative analyses. This is more directly a way of dealing with your own thinking compared with other people's thinking. And finally, there's analysis of past projects. It's not analyses, it's analysis. This is when you have a look at your past projects as a set and have a think about, oh, I tend to do this same thing all the time and I don't like it. Or I do like it. Why don't I strengthen that in my skills rather than struggle every time with these other things? It's becoming, designing your own designing, it's becoming aware of how you best work as a designer and why you do the things you do well, these things well, and why you do these other things not so well. All right, let's keep going. Okay, reflective journals. These are normally over a semester or a year. If you've got academic advising, there's a little button here. Does it want me to press? It's not going to want me to press it. Okay, reflective journals. If you in this North American school, so usually a college, and in high school, regularly what the students are required to do is attend various classes, as they are in any school, yours included. That's about the content that you're learning to understand and deal with. It's not so much about you directly and improving how you do essays or how you do your reflective thinking, how you do analyses of your own work and how you make a skilled and better way of looking what electives to take and how do you curate your own education? How do you organize that? That's what the journals are actually about. I'll show you some examples. Oh, this is a cartoon I saw in Scientific New Scientist. One of the things that you might find when you're documenting your own process is that most of it's about the thing that's easy to talk about is what were your disappointments, your setbacks, what didn't work. The hardest part is probably the one in the middle, noticing admitting that these were accidents and failures, and they're the ones you're going to learn from. And the breakthroughs and discoveries and successes, often you can't talk about. It happened so quick and off you went. In creative and problem-solving literature, they often talk about epiphanies, and these are breakthroughs, discoveries. All right. Here's an example of, it's not one of my students, but a student's reflective journal in week 4 of a graduate subject. But the person has taken lecture notes, and they've done some notes on their preparation. They've talked a bit what happened in the tutorial. There's a bit more here. And then here's a more formal, the same person with a bit more formal notes, the kinds of things they looked at, the kind of exercise that they did in the class, some really quick sketches. And this person is starting to talk about other examples of things that they thought about during the week. So it's about their classwork, but it's also about their daily life or the movies they saw that, oh, that's an idea I could try out, and things of that kind. Here's a different person who's done it online, obviously, as a series of Post-it notes of things that they've thought about. And they've kept different colors for saying different kinds of things. So it's it's already being categorized as they go. And reflective journals are easily the best way to do them, is to do them as you're going through the semester. Most classes that I've had to do with, or units of study, have a word limit, and reflective journals go over the word limit without you even noticing. If you're using them for seriously, and they are really rich tools for understanding your own thinking and yourself, and you get better and better at it as you go on. And people who start doing them, as you see, keep them in their professional life afterwards because they tell themselves. Now, this is from a particular lecture, Design as a Cultural Activity. And this is the person who's been looking at some other architects and they've done some analyses. So it's getting very formal and scholarly. And this is some studio work that they did in relation to what they found out. Made some models. This is their current project, and you can see that they're looking at how the other architects would do it, and then they've done some sketches afterwards of the way they prefer to do it, maybe. And decision diaries are a little different. These are for particular projects. What you're trying to do here is capture, these are the decisions I made and why I took them. Maybe you make a note of the evidence or the source of the ideas. Let me show you. Here we go. This person this is decision number 17. And they put the date down. It's a good idea to put the date down. This is they're puzzling over this plan for a house. It's like a terrace house, a row house, or a shop house in Malaysia, that sort of structure. And it's 3 stories high. And in practice, these are called blocking. This is a bubble diagram, as you'd be familiar with. These are called blocking and stacking diagrams. You know, how do you arrange things vertically? How do they interact, spaces, and how do they work on plan? So then there's another set of them, and they've added a different decision. This has got to do with allowing for different people to come and visit. So this is, I think, a second-year student. All right. Now, here they are. They've turned it into a model, and they can make some more decisions as they're working. And here's the beginnings of a serious drawing. And you can see it doesn't look as though it's so cut up as the model implied. Here they've been thinking. And so these are the principles of what they're doing, and they're checking. This time what they're doing is looking at a daily routine. And it's a way of doing it. Okay, now here's another example. This was a friend and I in 1999 and 2000. We did a project. This is part of the Fringe Festival in Melbourne one year. This is the project. It's called The Garden of the Cool Change. We've got some colleague to draw us a computer model of it. This is a scroll I did for talking about all the names of the parts of the garden. This is a model which my colleague built and various analytic accounts. And this is the planning for that water body in the middle of the garden. Here's the set of decisions. This is the date. This is the decision. This is what we did, or these are the activities more properly. And then these is my analysis afterwards. Here's another page of the same diary. And I'm obviously using it to go back to and look at analytically what we're trying to do. Here's a different version. This is called a precedence network. This is the decision. This is the one it led to. And these all happened on the same day. Wherever there's a circle, there's a decision made. And this is me working out what are the key decisions that had to happen in a particular order. These are all of those activities that I've taken from the rest of the diary. These are the dates. Wait a minute, I'll go back one. The dates are along the top. The month, year, month, day. We hadn't started this diary on the first day. I think it was about 4 months in that I went back over all the papers we had to try and puzzle about what was going on. Now, this is a long version of the whole year, 99, 5 months. Oh, these are weeks, I think, 5 weeks, 10 weeks, 15, 20 weeks in for the year. And the ideas were running between, the decisions were running between the ideas we were having about the design itself, the product of designing, and how we were going to present it. That got me very more important here. Now, this diagram goes for another 3 pages, I think, but you get the idea. What we're trying to do is tease out what was the pattern of the flow of the sets of ideas. Was there a standard sequence here in the way we were thinking, that sort of thing. And as you can see, it goes from ideas to design to presentation quite often, straight down as you'd expect. But there were some more sophisticated analyses that are possible because we had the evidence and we could go through it. And it produced all sorts of interesting papers. Now, comparative analyses, there's 2 ways to do them that students have done. One student will pick 2 designers that they think are very, very different. Christopher Alexander and, say, Peter Eisem is a classic one. Or nowadays, who would I pick? I'd put Zaha Hadid and Kenga Guma is really, really different to each other. Or Peter Zumthor and Mies van der Rohe, is very different from each other. And what you try and work out is where do you fit in between the 2? That's one way of doing them. The simpler way, apparently, is to try and pick a single designer and say, oh, this is how I'm the same and this is how I'm different. It's a lot easier if you don't like the designer because it's teasing out why you don't like them and why you like what you do. So here's some examples. 5 students. So this person looked at Jan Gehl and was mostly interested in these way of talking about the issues. This person looked at an anime illustration company and an architect, and these were the grounds of comparison for locating themselves between the 2. This person looked at Zaha Hadid and a designer from an Israeli designer working in the United States called Neri Oxman. And these 2 people, I think this person was first and this person was from another year, but she liked the categories that this person had used to do the analysis. So she used the same categories. Daniel Libeskind and Nigel Coates both talk about narrative architecture, and yet they're incredibly different designers. And finally, this person used Kenga Guma as their comparison. Not a lot of students use these comparative analyses because they're more for your scholarly student who likes reading a bit and looking at looking at other people's work to learn from. And some people have done it by having a studio where you're required to design like this designer. Standard American early year way of doing a studio. All right. The final way, the final technique I think that you could use for doing your own design, reflecting on your own designing, is analysis of past projects. But this is really best if you've got a lot of past projects to look at. You need ideally 3, I think, minimum. And you're doing it because you're looking for patterns in your design thinking. All right. So here's somebody, same person who we saw earlier doing a reflective journal. And this is an experience list of their past projects. So they got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 past studios. They're graduate student. So you might have 2 or 3 years to talk about, and you may have done more than one project in that time. So this is person's making some first notes, what their ideas were about the projects, who was the tutor, what was the name and what was the main task, what were the main criterion to look at, and then some little comments on it, on the outcome. So this is a quick and dirty analysis of past projects. Really useful exercise for yourself. So then she did a review. She wrote out the reviews, and then later on came along and made some more thoughts on these reviews. So is this somebody who's using the journal, in this case, past projects analysis, as a way of to provide evidence, then to reflect on? Right. And she used different ways of analysing the materials to see whether she could explain what it was she was thinking and doing. Now, this person is a formalist. They've probably done the same thing as the previous student, but they haven't presented that part of the work. They've set it all up so they've done it neatly on InDesign. So, okay. First of all, she's looking at what's common between the designers she's comparing and possibly herself. So often you end up with 3 different columns. And then points of difference, weaknesses. This might be a familiar analytical technique for you. Strengths. I've sent the slides of this lecture to Boo Roro, so you might ask to see them if you want to see some more detail later. Okay. So now we're finished. So what did we cover? We covered critical thinking. We covered critical thinking in design. We expanded that to critical reflection in design. So they were mostly about thinking, and thinking that was specific to looking at designing itself. And I brought up why I thought that some people found designing difficult because they had to think at too many layers and in about two issues simultaneously as they're working. And always they're under the influence of the braided stream of culture, society, and the literature of the discipline that's flowing past them and around them and through them as they're working. Finally, I looked at 4 vehicles for critical thinking. and critical reflection, particularly in your own designing. Ways to help you tease out what's good for you. These are the references. And I'm finished. Thank you. I'll pass back to Agus and Rora. Can't hear you.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Greg. Thank you. And maybe we can give him a virtual applause from a good and inspiring presentation. I'm sorry, in the back, my back wall is still under construction. It is the morning. The worker is still to work to build in my neighbor, building in my neighbor. I think this is one question from Sabian Natal. Let's talk about discussion.
Greg,
Okay,
I'm sorry. Greg, can you stop share screen so that we can share it? Thank you so much.
Okay, Sabian, are you here?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Greg, I think very interesting for my student, Sabian Nathanael. He mentioned several terms, important terms in design thinking discourses, design research, weak problem, and yes, research approach, design research approach, etc. Please, Sabian, can you ask directly to Greg? Thank you, Sabian. Please, Sabian.
Yes, sir. So, in one of your papers I've read, Wicked Deliberations, you mentioned that some of the students tried a design research approach that were rather, well, to be said, unorthodox in my opinion, such as living in an animal suit as an approach to creating a wildlife reserve, if I remember correctly, or making a role-playing game trials. Other than that, you also mentioned that there are students who ended up confused in trying different forms of data analysis and design research approaches. In your opinion, does having a more orthodox way of design research approach contributes to a clearer data analysis? On the other hand, does having a wicked problem calls for an unorthodox way of design research in hopes of getting an insight that normal design research approaches can acquire? I'm sorry if that's.
No, I understand your question, but I don't think it's either or. In the Wicked Deliberation Studio, one of the deliberate tactics was to get people to use their normal conventional way of doing things, at least for a while, deliberately to choose an unconventional way to contrast with it. And they weren't allowed to unify them for at least a month. And a lot of students had a lot of trouble finding another way of doing things. They felt so confident about the way they were presently doing it. But once they saw none of the students were working on the same project, but so I always try to get students in the studio to work as a kind of cooperative help group for everybody else. It's, because I argue you can all get firsts. And you shouldn't be precious of ideas. One of the evidences of people being confident about their own work is that they're prepared to share. And if you're watching what other people are doing, you've got another 14 or 15 people in the studio who are experimenters like you, and you can learn from what they find out, and you can also learn from what the tutors are saying to them. You don't have to wait your turn. I've had students in the past who sit there politely and don't hear anything, and they wonder why they're struggling. You've invested the time to come to the studio, so make use of all the information you get. We know from research in personality development that young children learn more from their friends than they do from their parents very quickly in life. So same thing happens in university if you allow it. All right, now the more serious part of your question is, do you do things in a strange way for strange situations, or would more conventional way help? I suspect it depends on you. One of the things for, unless you're doing, I don't know, McDonald's restaurants all the time, where they've got a guidebook as to how you will do things, nearly all designs will be unusual for you in your career. It won't be like the last time. So you're always in a situation where it's unusual to some degree. It's not the same government, it's not the same councils, it's not the same piece of land, it's certainly not the same people, usually. So all of those things contribute to making every design situation unique. So I would argue that the one stable part of the situation is you. And even that's not stable, that's slowly developing and evolving through your career. So how do you train yourself to be a good athlete? Oh, you push yourself. You exercise a lot, and you try out different forms of exercise until you know which ones work for you. Likewise in designing. You're training your brain. You're training your thinking in trying out different ways. I think the most common reaction I've had from students who later talk about those sort of studios is they enjoyed it at least. And we know also from creative research that if you're having fun, you're learning. So take the risk. Designing is a risky business anyway. You've got to move outside your comfort. You're trying to move into the future after all. So try it out, I would recommend. Yeah. Do we have other questions?
All right, thank you, sir.
Yep, pleasure.
It's very helpful. Thank you, sir.
Sorry, very. I start to text in my comment is design is what's it you say? I forget. Design is a risky activity. Okay, it's your mean, correct? Design is a risky activity.
Yep.
Yep. Yes. I forgot to text it because it's very. I'm interested for your last statement that the design is a very risky activity. It's okay.
You have to take risks.
You said that yeah, the student have to take risks. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sabian, have you any comment to criticize Greg answer? Maybe if you have a critical response, please text and we will discuss it in the next session. And the second student is Savio. Hello, Savio, are you here?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Savio, can you talk to Greg? What is your curiosity?
Yeah, so I've read Thinking About Thinking Design, and I was impressed by how the students worked out some beautiful examples of metacognitive thinking. Some expressed their true hearts through desire and worries. Some wrote a very poetic piece of mind. And not to mention the last student who wrote, I think I will never have no questions. The more I learn, the more I need to learn. I think it's very beautiful and deep how when we ask ourselves about our own thinking, we don't run out of questions. We get more questions.
Yep.
So metacognition is surely something personal, and it's going back and forth between questioning the way we think and understanding it wholly. Oh, this is how I think. I've made a pattern all this time. I've made a pattern, and this is the way I think. This is why I chose this decision. This is why I made this design, etc. What are some tips that you think help the most for students to achieve this level of thinking? Because I think without proper understanding of how it works and sufficient critical thinking skills, it will only make them more confused, like circling around many deep thinking about your own thinking and slowly getting more lost for not finding any good answer. It's like it made you overthink.
It can. It's one of the reasons I suspect I like notebooks for writing down things that you can then sit and think and treat them as objective things out there, evidence to think about, rather than trying to do it inside your mind all the time. Now, another bit we've recently became more popular amongst psychologists is the idea that your mind isn't all between in the bones in your head. We are social animals, and a lot of our memories and things exist in other people's care. And for humans, we put a lot of things down on paper or on computers or things external to ourselves. So your mind partly exists in those other in those other things, and they fade away or you lose them in just the same way as your memories in your brain are there. They're not permanently there. It seems the way our memories work is that we, the analogy I think of is sampling. When you look at an event, the way you've trained yourself as you've grown up, you learn to sample things in a certain way. You pick, just like a DJ does. And then a memory is an act of reconstruction from the samples you've got. So your neighbour who attended the same event will remember it quite a bit differently from you. All right. So this business about learning to think and not getting lost might be to do with what kind of controls you put on recall, or what kind of bones do you provide externally, and that are, inverted commas, objective, so that you can use them to come back, and they provide a kind of anchor for your thinking in life. Why I talked about diagrams and texts as evidence for allowing you to think with. It's not your thinking itself, but they're tools for external tools for thinking with. And once you make them external, it's like old photographs. The photograph says you were here and this is what you were doing, but it also says you were here and this is what you were doing then. Not now, but then. So it's a photograph is a reminder that it's past. Text is a reminder that a thing is past. So it allows you the freedom, if you notice, to go into the future from there. So one of the things is having a kind of, and it's like all human activities, you get better as you practice it. So start with little leaps at the start. Don't ask too much of you. I mean, I once read somewhere that designers become famous in their late 40s. And I can think of some designers who became famous much later than that. Louis Kahn, he'd done something like 300 houses by the time he was famous in his 60s. You have to be patient with yourself, particularly as a student. All these staff around you, me included, show you famous examples of people and famous buildings that have won awards and Pritzker prizes and all that sort of thing. And you're looking at your work and saying, oh, I can't do that yet. That's true. So you got to, but you can't run a mile in, 100 meters in 9 seconds either. You have to practice a lot to get close. That's true also of being a designer. You be patient with yourself. It's like most things in life. Youth is relatively impatient. It can understand the ideas, but to be comfortable in floating in that sea of stuff, you got to learn how to swim, and that'll take a while, I think. Yeah. Does that make sense? You need a kind of structure.
Okay.
And yours, the way you know, I'll give you some examples that I know have worked for students in the past. One way is to focus on one designer that they like or one book that they like. And that becomes a kind of spine for comparing other designers. And gradually it increases their knowledge of architectural history and a number of projects. Some students find a particular range of projects, I don't know, mosques or supermarkets or, I don't know, seaside resorts might be the thing that they're really interested in. And they gradually see ways of doing that that are rich and more interesting, and they gradually see that there are different kinds. And all the time they're building their understanding of their field that they're in. But they've got a kind of backbone of understanding of having done some serious study about one part of it that is attractive to them and interesting to them. And that's chicken and egg. Because you've done a study of Mies van der Rohe, you might like to do things like Mies van der Rohe. So you have to be careful of that. You might like, that might worry you. But that's something you gradually come to understand in life. I think I read my first architectural book in 5th year or something like that. I did all the homework and everything I was supposed to do, but actually just picking up a book because I was interested in reading it was happened in about 5th year. So during my master's degree, equivalent. I read Notes on the Synthesis of Form by Christopher Alexander. It was his PhD originally, but it was really interesting to read as an argument. So that started me off getting interested in design methods and things like that back then. And design methods at the time was mixed up with environmental psychology. They hadn't really gone 2 different paths yet. So I was reading in both those areas eventually. But I found by far the best way to learn was to teach. So I'd started teaching in my 2nd year, the end of my 2nd year at uni. And so one of the things I've been doing in design studios all my life is looking out for the student who's so comfortable in themselves that they're happy to help other students. That kind of student, I find them really interesting. They're usually students are doing best in the class anyway. They're often more humble than others, though not always, certainly not always. Particularly if they're women, actually, they'll be humble. And they're a useful person to getting to know and to working with as a for students who lack a little confidence, or who are smart enough to know that they don't know it all. All right. The best students know that, and the worrying ones are the ones who that terrifies, and the ones who know that but say, okay, I'm going to do something about it. They're the best students, or the ones that will succeed best. Yeah. I'll stop, otherwise I'll just keep talking.
Another question.
Yeah.
Okay, there's one question from I'm sorry. Dante. Okay, Dante is interesting with your concept. Brush with rhetoric. Okay, Dante, please ask directly to Greg, please.
Yes, hello, Professor. First of
Hi.
all, thank you so much for your very interesting presentation. Oh, And I would like to ask, I've read your paper, Brush with Rhetoric, and you wrote that Greenway was able to convey the creative symbolism and riches of the Pillow Book through the audience's hard work and willingness to dissect the movie. But I think that this implies time, effort, and focus, which sometimes I think architects can't really afford every time, in the sense that people aren't really aware of their daily surroundings, and so sometimes architects' works just becomes the background in people's daily lives. So in that sense, what tactic could an architect possibly use so that with one glance, people can achieve a similar level of understanding of the architect's design as they do to movies? Thank you.
Well, the architect's got the problem that he can't capture them and keep them all sitting in a dark room looking at a screen. If you go to the movies with your friends, if you watch movies on your own laptop, you're already committed to looking at the movie. So the architect's in a bit of a problem there. But some buildings, well, some buildings do it by luckily being public buildings, and they've got a license to stand out from the crowd. And some buildings do it behind the facade. You will all probably know houses that once you enter the house, you go, oh, I like being here. And some buildings are houses that you walk into, usually houses, and you just feel comfortable and you don't notice them. Now, it's actually true of architects. You get a bunch of architects together at a conference, for example, and you talk to them afterwards and ask them what the building was like. A lot of them can't remember what the building was like. Because as animals talking to other animals like ourselves, we are much more interested in the other people than we are usually in the surroundings, unless we're a bit strange. Now, there are some architects who are very strange, and there's a journal I get called Divisari. It's a German-based journal online, and all the photographs I can't think of too many, or maybe I've been reading it. It comes once a month, and I've been getting it for at least 10 years, I think. And there's probably 2 photographs that have got a person in. That's one way you can look at architecture. I don't think it's a very interesting way to look at architecture, more than for a few seconds. But there are the more subtle ways are the people like Zumthor. It's really difficult to go into a Zumthor building and not immediately get interested. He does it by things like texture and even acoustics. The Serpentine Pavilion, which is the one I particularly saw, was made out of a cheap timber frame with plywood on it, and it had hessian put over that, and it was all spray painted black, except for the floor. The floor was also plywood, but was covered in sand, thinly. So when you walked on it, it crunched under your feet. So immediately acoustically, it was different from being outside. And it was a ring. So it was a rectangular ring, this corridor. The corridor was very tall. And you're inside a big park outside, and you're walking through the greenery underneath the canopy of the trees, the black trunks. You walked into this black long building. The acoustics crunch, crunch, crunch under your feet in this black space. And then you came out into the middle, and it was a flower meadow in beautiful flowers. And you just went, oh, because you're in this sunlit space, the only way you could look was, the only opening was to the sky. So the blue sky was like a Tyrol artwork. So that what he'd done was, through very simple means, control your experience, going from inside to outside. And from once you're inside and you've had enough, then you can walk back outside through that sequence of zones. Some thoughts particularly good at that. The business of closing down often for an experience, an interior experience. David Leatherbarrow, it wasn't, no, is it? Well, I think it was David Leatherbarrow. No, it was Rybczynski. No, McCarter. What's McCarter's first name? I can't think of McCarter's first name. Anyway, he wrote an argument that all architecture, inside and outside, is actually an interior experience. You're in the street, you're in the city. And so what he was talking about was that for architects and people who live in buildings, one of the standard, strongest experiences is the act of entering a space. And so he was talking about, how did you prepare somebody for going into a special space, whether the special space was the street or a public building interior or a sitting room or whatever. And there's a whole lot of techniques for doing it. Often the space in between, the narthex in a Christian church, from outside to inside, the space in between concentrates your understanding, and then you go into the big space. So that's one technique. Controlling and manipulating the kind of experience. So people have to pay attention. If you think about people being in large crowds or being at a party, what part of the architecture can they actually see? Well, it's only the bit above their heads or at a doorway. So maybe that's why a lot of people, particularly in traditional architecture, are very careful about what goes on at the door, so that you know when you're going outside the property to inside the property, when you're going from inside the property to inside the house, or from inside the entrance, inside to the main space, those kind of sequences of experiences. A lot of architects do it by manipulating the ceiling height. We know from the psychological research that a little difference in the width of a room or the length of a room, you don't notice. A little difference between the height of the ceiling, you really do notice. So there's a whole lot of standard, not tricks, but devices that architects have learned over years and years and years of doing it, from thousands of cultures, how to make things feel special. Now, for some people with particular cultural experiences, they've learned how to notice what's special in their own culture. So when they go to another one, they may not notice what those people notice. And it's mainly got to do with how you learn to take notice of what they, I mean, how often do you go to a building and say, why is it like that? What is the architect trying to do? What's the designer trying to do?
I'm sorry, Greg, this is there any interesting question? Dante, can what is Greg is answer your curiosity?
Yes, thank you for the answer.
Okay.
Thank you for the answer. I think that was a
Okay.
very interesting one. Thank you very much, Professor.
Okay. I'm sorry, Greg, because there are interesting question from my colleagues, Pak Ahmad Tardiana, Pak Apep. In previous conversation discussed, he also famous architect in Indonesia, and the important thing that he talked in our discussion is the concept of reflective precision from Donald Trump is important from him to accumulate the knowledge after the practice. But it's my opinion, Pak Apep. So your turn to directly talk and make a fruitful discussion with Greg. Please, Pak Apep.
Hi, Greg. Morning.
Hi,
Ahmad here.
Ahmed.
Yeah, thank you for your inspiring presentation. I have two questions actually. The first one is related directly to your presentation. From your presentation, I understand that self-discipline, as you mentioned before, I think would be one of the most important ability that architects should have, since the critical or reflective thinking require a quite labor in doing such activity as note-taking and journal writing along the process of designing. In the context of studio teaching, what is your method in disciplining, so-called disciplining the student to do the note-taking and journal writing? That's my first question.
Okay, but there's an easy answer to that one. At the end of this, at one point, I wrote into all the design subjects in the course, undergraduate and graduate, that 10 to 15. I think it was originally 20% of the marks were for reflective journal.
Okay.
Okay. In my experience, the undergraduate studios used to check it and they were diligent about marking it. And in my experience, the graduate studios ignored it, except a few.
Okay.
All right. Now, within my own studios, of course, the students kept one because they knew I was looking for it. But the technique was, for those who'd not done it before, the easiest thing was to say, write down 3 things you learned today, three things that you wished you had, and 3 things you're going to try out for next time at some time in the future. That was all they had to do. And that got them in the practice of doing it. And you allowed 15 minutes at the end of any session to do it. That sort of worked best for undergraduate students. Graduate students, I think it's easier to my argument with graduate students is that they'd been admitted to the graduate school because they can design. Mm-hmm. So what graduate school is primarily about is getting students to take control of their designing. And it's much more important to get into those deeper levels of thinking to do that and having richer mechanisms for dealing with it. Yeah. So what's your other question?
Thank you. That's very clear. The second one would be, it's my question is more general, in particular to Indonesia context where we face a very pressing problem of social and environmental problems. Yep. I believe that architecture is one of the problem itself as well as its solution. So I'm convinced that the way we educate students in looking at those problems critically in the studio can help them in understanding the problem they see in the real world and be part of the solution. Yep. In this case, critical thinking to respond to the critical situation. So, and any thought about this, Greg?
Yes. I get in the habit of trying very hard not to use the phrasing problem and solution. Partly because I think people think if you talk about solutions, there is one. And in my experience of a lot of designers, what they're working in a context. They've been working on something that's of interest to them before they've got the actual project.
Okay.
It's particularly true in industrial design because they're trying things out. They want to try some things that they've learned from the last one for the next occasion. But I think architects do that too, especially as they get older and more experienced. There's something they want to try out, or they're looking for an occasion to use. And I think in those cases, some people talk about it. They don't solve a problem so much as define it, and then the way I would phrase it is they set their own task. And when you set the task, what you do simultaneously, even if you don't notice, is define the context. Mm-hmm. And the thing that you're doing as a designer is negotiating with that context as you go, and the context might be the client, at least at one level, but it's certainly the authorities, and it's your own profession, it's the conditions of daily life. All of those things are involved in the context of what you're choosing to set as the task that you're going to address. Now, some people, because it's more comfortable for them, I find a lot of designers, for example, are not interested in politics. They don't want to deal with that. They're concerned with the aesthetics of an object. But in the situation where you've got, particularly amongst young designers and young students, I think there was something in yesterday's newspaper here where 70% of young people who are doing year 12 think that the world is going to be much worse for them as they grow up than it was for us, or for me, my age, boomers, as they're called. Now, just looking at it, I probably agree with them, but they've still got to deal with it. So I think another way of describing what I think the situation is, I had a PhD student who looked at what the studio problems, the studio tasks were set by 5 different architecture schools as compared with what the local architects institutes claimed they were about, their mission statements, and what the schools said their mission statements were, or the universities did. And as you can imagine, there are all sorts of things about dealing with the environment and including all the peoples, different kinds and different communities, and of, developing the culture, And 80% of the studios were about art galleries or museums. And
that's my point actually about the,
the situation. So one of the things obviously is to set studios. I mean, we here in our own school, it's my observation that the bias has gone towards multiple housing as projects. And I can remember when I was a student, we never did a high-rise building. And the implication was, in fact, that it was morally wrong to design a high-rise building as a student. And of course, an awful lot of architects went on to do nothing else when they graduated.
Yeah. In fact, actually, less of us doing the high-rise project in the real project when they are graduated, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. And that'll be their novel project. They haven't never done one. I mean, my experience was that my first architectural job was to be given a 45-story building to do the town planning application for, which meant I had to mostly design it to work it out. And I'd never done any such thing. So you learn a lot and real quick.
Okay.
So that's not a bad way to learn.
Okay. It's enough, Papet, because there's the very interesting question from my student, Shima Adil.
Thank you.
Okay.
You have to change, basically, you have to change the studios that you run.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, Shima. Yes. In previous day, I have this intensive discussion with Shima, and I think she's try to exercise thinking to do in my task. And I think here's the problem, the contradiction, but I think reflective thinking and how the public expect it from the work. Shima, are you here? Shima Adil?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, yes.
Hello, Professor Greg. Thank you for your lecture. It's really interesting.
Okay.
So I read our paper about research-led design, and it's mentioned that the Ariadne spread help the student to be clear about their design method, and also in order to fulfill their needs and also the public expectations. And it is stated in your paper that to apply this method, you conduct a workshop using several approachment in designing, and I'm interested with the narrative approach. It is stated that when using the narrative approach, the outcomes are more likely to be more interesting, and the students are more likely to solve their design quickly. And as for myself, I've used this method in one of my study assignments. To be more precise, is when I design a vacation house, and I do enjoy the design process. And also, it's true that my outcome are even more interesting than my previous assignment. But unfortunately, I realized that by using this narrative method, I kind of ignore the public expectation or public needs from my design. And it's a bit contradict with the aim of this method, which to solve the designer needs and also the public expectation. So from your point of view, how does this method help solve the public needs? Thank you, Professor.
Partly it's the narrative that you choose, I suspect. If you can, I mean, there's two answers. One is about what does a work of architecture consist of? This is the sort of professional and let's say pragmatic way to think about it. There's a whole lot of things you've got to include in the building, whatever building it is, and whatever the building looks like. It's got to, be safe. It's got to stand up. It's got to be safe in a fire so you can escape, and it's got to have public facilities. And it can't overshadow its neighbour, and it can't reflect light into people's eyes and all those sort of things. All right. And these days we want it to be sustainable and zero energy using, net zero. All right. That's the pragmatic side. So as a student, you get better and better and better at including all those things automatically. Yeah. And some schools formally do it by teaching design where you do one thing in your first semester, then you add another thing in second semester, and then you add a third thing. Surabaya used to do this, ITS, where by the time you finished your 7th studio, you'd added 7 different things. And so every semester, the design got a different issue to add to the previous issues that you were dealing with. All right. That's one level of, so you've got to, again, be patient with yourself at being able to do that. You'll get better and better at it. And you certainly get better at it really quick if you've worked in an office for say, as an intern for, say, a semester, or even for a few weeks at Christmas over the holiday period. Now, the other answer is about choosing the narrative that you want. One way is to choose a public narrative, one that's shared in the community as the basis for your designing, or to work out a way where the private narrative that you want to deal with reflects a public one, so that you're automatically working at the 2 layers in the way you're running your narrative. I'll give you an example. A 3rd year student at RMIT a long time ago decided that there was a Stockman's Hall of Fame to be designed in Australia. It exists in Longreach now. It was a competition. And he took the brief for that project to design. Now, what he decided was he was going to use, the thing he was particularly interested in was the Chinese immigrants that had worked in Australia as to do with cattle industry as it was growing up. A lot of them had been working in Australia as laundrymen or cooks and merchants, like traders, or they were the 3 professions other than digging for gold themselves, say. And one of one of the ways to think about this was in terms of a dragon. In Western thinking, but particularly English Western thinking, dragons are nasty things, right? But in Chinese thinking, dragons are particularly beneficial, helpful things. So he could have the building suggest a dragon, and there was two entirely different ways of reading it for the audience. That was the way, and how the narrative played out through the interiors of the buildings, he didn't handle very well, actually, but that's the starting point he had. He'd worked out a narrative that could be read in two different directions easily. Now, lots and lots of public buildings have narratives that are superimposed onto each other through history. You know, why is a mosque like it is? Why is a church like it is? It's got a lot of history in the background. So there are many layers of the narrative that are already there. Now, houses, particularly in some cultures, are likewise layered. I'm trying to think of the, there's an island north of Java where the houses have got 3 levels. Or they think of them as having 3 levels. And the basement, which is where the stilts are, is the profane level. The space inside the roof is the religious level, and the bit in between, you just live, just in inverted commas, live your life. And it's a 3x3 grid, the structural system for the house. So there's a special place right in the middle that has certain tasks and a layer of living around it, which is less sacred, you might think. So there's a whole tradition of how you think about a house in that community. So they're all.
I'm sorry. Yes, yes, our time is limited, but there's a several questions from lecture from me. I think if Sima, thank you, Sima, and if Sima, what is it? Express their curiosity about the thinking and that mismatch with the public opinion. But the other side is our lecture, Bu Widi. Maybe I read your question, Bu Widi. Yes. There's some problem about thinking and the expression of thinking that can be understood with the other. Yes, the problem, the latent problem is what a student want and what is teacher want is don't match. Bu Widi asks, that she feel that in this teaching experience, students who apply drawing tools, SketchUp, AutoCAD, concentrate not on the thinking, the depth thinking, critical thinking, just looking good, just to produce something, not represent the deep thinking. Okay, can you share your experience how to stimulate the student? It's not only produce the nice drawing, but it is a learning. They need to exercise the thinking, the express the thinking in the digital tools, digital way, especially in studio. Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, again, there's at least 2 levels. One level is the level where the digital tools are being used within a particular subject or unit, class. So maybe the criterion for the class have got to include things that draw out critical thinking. You require a journal or you require an argument from the student or a thesis as to why they're doing what they're doing. That's one level. The second level is there's quite a bit of work done in architectural journals now about the consequences of particular representational tools for designs. I'll give you an example. I had a student, one of the things I do in my design method subject was require students to design very quick exercises. It might be 5 minutes to do something, like design a house in 5 minutes. And I've suggested over the years that students use a fat pencil or a fat fountain pen or a fat marker pen to do this. because you can keep the whole of, and provided you keep the drawing about the size of your hand with a fat pen, you can do it very quickly, but also you can see the whole thing at once in focus. I had one student who complained about this. Only one in all the years I've been doing it, because he liked drawing with a very fine pen. Because it took such a long time to make the drawing, it left him time to think. So that's an example of having understanding that your method of making a design influences how you think and how you can think. So maybe that to get the students to understand the limitations of digital drawings for producing designs is you show other ways of designing, and you have at least some discussions about what's good about models as compared with a drawing in a computer, a digital drawing. The other one I can remember is a friend of mine was running a project, a company in Thailand. Now, he was in a bar at the airport, and he got talking to this fellow, and the fellow said, explained that he was a developer, and he said, "Oh, I'm really interested. You're an architect. I've got this problem with a very long project. It runs 2 kilometers long, along this freeway, and it's a housing project. So I don't know how I'd tackle it." And then he went off to the toilet. By the time he got back from the toilet, the architect had designed a scheme for him, freehand on a napkin. He got the job. The budget was $2 billion US. All right. And then he got another job from the same developer because he'd done the first one. That kind of thing tends to make some students pick up their interest in learning how to sketch.
Okay, thank you. I think time is up, and still 3 questions, one from Roro and 2 from me. But
okay,
in 9 o'clock Indonesian time, some students have another lecture. Yes, I will. I think the formal discussion will be stopped here because of limitation of time, and I will be back. I will to put it back to Roro as the host, maybe to close. And I think if Greg is available and some of participants have joined the discuss, maybe we have 15 minutes more or
yep.
To this informal discussion. But formally, as a moderator, I close this session from Greg, and I back the time to the host to Roro to close formally the session. Maybe we will continue with a discussion. Is we can arrange later. Thank you, Roro. It's your time. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pak Agus, for moderating this session, and also for Greg for making time again. That was a thoughtful presentation, insightful presentation that I believe our student can get something from the talk. And probably before I close, I would probably give kind of not like a homework, but more like an exercise probably that Greg suggests, especially for the student of architectural design theory. Please, you can write it down, and I will give a note. Please list 3 things you have learned today, right, Greg? So the first is 3 things you learned today from the lecture for sure, and then the second one is 3 things that you would like to learn but you didn't, and then the third one is 3 things that you want to do later after this presentation. What's the carry out from this lecture? I think that's the start from, that's the how we start the critical thinking exercise.
After this lecture.
Yes. Okay. All right. So thank you so much, Greg, again for making time with us here. We will see you probably next time. We will arrange more meeting with you. And also, I remind you that this is the second of our guest lecture series. So we still have 3 more. Next is Hannah and Stuart, Hannah Louie and Stuart King about architectural history. And then we will have Julie Willis about gender and hospital design. And also we will have Alan Pert about well-being design. So I think that's all for now. Thank you. So, before we close, I think we should have a photo session. Probably Danny can help us with the process. Danny, do you hear me? All right.
Thank you, Bu Roro. Okay, we will have a photo session. Please, the participant, open your camera. Okay.
Can you count it down, Danny? Before
Okay,
you...
wait. I have 6 pages, so I will take 6 photos. So please hold your smile. Okay, for the wait minute for the first page. 1, 2, 3. Okay, for the second. 1, 2, 3. Again. 1, 2, 3. Again. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And for the last, 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you, Bu Roro. I think it's
Okay.
enough.
Thank you so much, Danny, for your help. Again, thank you, Greg, for joining us here.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you. And I have to close this with
Session,
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you.